Really wonderful to be back in this room. Those of us with longer memories do recall the frequency, well, at least once a year, when we used to have meetings in here for the fellowship, in the days when town halls opened on Saturdays, and when there was money around, and all that stopped about 10 years ago. But the council very kindly allowed us to have an event here during the bicentenary, and they have been very supportive indeed during this festival. We're not quite halfway through it yet in terms of numbers of events that have taken place. But the Mayor of Nuneaton and Bedworth, Councillor Jeff Clark, who is sitting here, opened our festival at the museum a week ago yesterday. So that's great support from the council for what we are doing in the area. And we're delighted that the Mayor is also here this afternoon, and he'll say a few words in a minute. I think there might be one or two people who haven't arrived yet, so if they do just creep in, obviously we'll just carry on regardless. But there are about 10 or so more people than we had expected, which is wonderful. I'm delighted, particularly since we're going to be listening to Professor Rosemary Ashton, who is worth travelling a long way to hear talk. And it's wonderful that so many of our vice presidents are here. Always good to see them and to know that they are supporting us in the way that they are doing this afternoon. So before I introduce Rosemary more formally, Jeff, Mr. Mayor, would you care to say just a few words to introduce?
Good afternoon everyone, and welcome to Nuneaton and Bedworth Borough Council and to Nuneaton's Town Hall. Some of you may be aware Nuneaton was the council house originally, renamed the Town Hall more latterly. It was started being built in 1932, completed in 1934. It sits on a concrete bed, floating bed for the safety because of the river anchor. It was necessary to ensure that we got a bed underneath it when it was built. The site completed in 1934, and we have used it ever since. Really pleased to be able to welcome the George Eliot Fellowship back here today, and I was really pleased as well to actually go to the lecture, or the Middlemarch lecture, at the museum last week, which was very nice and very interesting, I must admit. So I'll do no more than welcome you here and hope you have an enjoyable afternoon, and I'll pass over back to you, John.
Okay, yes, thank you. There are refreshments, and you can be given instructions. I think one or two people have found them already, but hopefully they'll be there. They'll be there at the end of the afternoon as well. And again, it's very kind of the council who are providing those free of charge, as well as not charging us for this room. That's very good, isn't it? It's a real sign of the cooperation that can exist between a group like ours and the local authority. It takes me back so many years really, when Kathleen and Bill were ruling the George Eliot Fellowship, and it takes me back to so many meetings. It was usually the case that the annual lecture took place here, which is why I'm so pleased that the council have agreed to let us use this building for today's annual lecture. We've rearranged dates, as you're aware, so that we can fit lots of things that would happen anyway into the month of the festival. But it's a huge pleasure to welcome Professor Rosemary Ashton, who is known for her work really all over the literary critical world, and she's had honours bestowed on her from all over the world. And we know her particularly for her books on George Eliot, of course. Her biography is wonderful and still highly regarded. And for her book on George Henry Lewis, and for the wonderful volume 142 Strand, which never ceases to amuse and entertain and inform, of course. But also she's been involved in so much 19th century literary criticism, work on German literature, work on Coleridge, on the Carlyles, and then more recently a massive amount of work on the Bloomsbury group, which I I suspect took several years of your life.
Not the Bloomsbury group.
Not the Bloomsbury group.
The Victorian Bloomsbury. The whole point was to say, look, the Bloomsbury is not the Bloomsbury.
Just the group. Right.
Sorry.
No, that's all right. I'm happy to be correct. And then most recently, One Hot Summer. We're having a one hot summer, aren't we? And the second part of the title of Rosemary's book was The Great Stink of 1848. And there's been quite a lot of stink from Westminster in this one long hot summer, but it's come from inside the building rather than from the river, I suspect. But we better not get political over that. But it's always a pleasure to welcome Rosemary. And I'll hand over to you now, Rosemary. You will explain the format that your talk will give. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks. I'm going to stand. I was given the option, but I've never given a lecture sitting down, so I feel I better do what I usually do. I won't use the microphone unless you have difficulties, and please, if anybody does, just raise a hand discreetly and I can press on the microphone. I want you to be able to hear, but I think it's nicer if we can do without the microphone. But do let me know. Well, the title and the subject of my talk today is Coming to Conclusions in Middlemarch. And it's obvious, I suppose, that when we talk about coming to conclusions, or indeed about conclusions, what we mean really is, on the one hand, endings, the conclusion of a novel, and many novels, I've looked up quite a lot just to make sure that this happens. A lot of novels, particularly 19th century novels, beginning with Jane Austen, of course, have a conclusion. They have chapter 1, chapter, and then a conclusion. So it's quite a thing for the novel in particular. But anyway, conclusions are endings, but they're also judgments. You come to a conclusion, you come to a judgment, which might be an intellectual judgment, social judgment, political judgment, or moral judgment, or a complication of all of those. And I think if you look at it in terms of novel writing, and in particular George Eliot's novel writing, you'll find, I think, that a tension exists between the two kinds of conclusion. And that's what I want to explore today. And I'll look, to some extent, at George Eliot's theory. She did have a theory, not too theoretical, but she had a theory of fiction. And I'll look a little bit at her theory, and a little bit at Adam Bede, which important because it's her very first novel, and then move swiftly and, as it were, completely on to Middlemarch, which is the main topic of the talk. However, I'm going to start at the end, because her last published work wasn't a novel, it was The Impressions of Theophrastus Such, not a terribly attractive title, and the book itself is rather odd. It's a set of aphorisms, or essays really, on various subjects that had interested George Eliot, and I think its interest for readers is rather mixed. It depends on what you like, but it's not in some ways typical of George Eliot. However, she published it in the last year of her life, 1879, and it has got a number of essays which deal with the question of writing and writing fiction in particular. One essay, The Too Ready Writer, addresses the problem of the potential narrowness of any one consciousness, including the consciousness of a novelist, the mind of the novelist. Now here she might have her own fiction in mind when she makes her sceptical narrator. Theophrastus is a sceptic on all fronts. She makes him talk about the necessity of opening one's mind to a variety of beliefs, experiences, and points of view. And I'm quoting now, Theophrastus says, "There's monotony and narrowness already to spare in my own identity. What comes to me from without should be larger and more impartial than the judgment of any single interpreter." In another essay, Shadows of the Coming Race, Theophrastus rather slyly considers the possibility that in the future there will be a machine for drawing the right conclusion, which will doubtless by and by be improved into an automaton for finding true premises. Well, I take these remarks, sly and clever and sceptical in Theophrastus Such's mouth, I take these remarks about avoiding singleness of mind and the egotism really which is inevitably involved in taking one attitude toward, especially when writing about human nature. I take these remarks as a statement of George Eliot's scepticism about coming to conclusions in the sense of judgments. How can any single and therefore circumscribed mind draw correct intellectual and moral conclusions? Since conclusions are also, as I've said, endings, we should look also at last acts, last events, and last sentences and last words, which I'll do a little bit towards the end of my lecture. Now, there's a paradox at the heart of George Eliot's efforts and achievements as a novelist. She sometimes claims, through her fictional narrators, that we should not judge our fellow mortals, but accept them as they are. That's what the narrator says in chapter 1 of Adam Bede, the first of her novels, which was published in 1859. Sorry, in chapter 17, I beg your pardon. But she just as often suggests the necessity of judging motives and actions. Indeed, she applies a code of ethics begun or derived from Christianity, but with the addition or the tempering of the religion of humanity of Spinoza and of Ludwig Feuerbach, both of whom she knew, read and translated. And also by the wise tolerance of the German novelist Goethe, about whom she also knew a great deal and wrote. Readers sometimes, perhaps almost always, think of her as a didactic author who lectures us about the morality of human actions. Sometimes it's true she does bang on a bit, as the Booker Prize winner Alan Hollinghurst said of her in an interview that he gave in The Guardian in 2017. She bangs on a bit. But he also said, in the same sentence, he talked about the brilliance that she shows in her use of the shifting point of view and the irony in her reflections on life. Now, one of the things I've done over the last 10 to 15 years is to collect examples from Sunday supplements, from The Guardian, from The Observer, The Sunday Times, or from Radio 4, wherever it might be, examples of modern novelists, famous contemporary novelists, talking, usually with very, very strong admiration of George Eliot. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. I'll give you one or two more examples. Well, I think that what she does is she makes use of a strong narrative voice, for sure, but it's usually more subtle and nuanced than merely being bossy. Open-mindedness, generous humour, irony, scepticism, these are the qualities that her narrative voice conveys and wishes readers to share. Sometimes her narrators are even willing to express uncertainty. And when I said scepticism, I didn't mean the kind of narrow, negative cynicism that is often, used or thought of in the same breath as scepticism, something limiting, something narrow, something negative. I meant what she thought of as a kind of scientific scepticism. That is, an open-mindedness, a refusal to shut down and draw only one conclusion. Again, there'll be more of that in a moment. Now, Adam Bede, the first novel by the mysterious new author George Eliot, was an instant success with readers and critics alike on its appearance in 1859. They marvelled at its humour, its pathos, its believable dialogue, its representation of class differences, and its successful embedding of credible characters in their provincial context. It was hailed for the realism of its setting and the shrewd human psychology exhibited in it, its psychological realism, in other words. And that's something more than what G.H. Lewis, George Eliot's life partner, of course, called in one of his journalistic articles, coat and waistcoat realism. You can hear what he's meaning by that, just a kind of boring descriptiveness without any depth, without going behind the coat and the waistcoat to see what's going on underneath. So that's not the kind of realism that George Eliot is interested in, of course. In chapter 17, a rather famous chapter in Adam Bede, in which the story pauses a little, the narrator boldly sets out a realist manifesto on the art of fiction. He, because it is a he at this point, George Eliot, unknown but assumed to be a man, he insists on the necessity for art to represent life in all its details. Ugly as well as beautiful, poor as well as rich, flawed as well as perfect. An imagined reader, my idealistic friend, who dislikes vulgar details, is tutored on the topic of the rare, precious quality of truthfulness which is to be found in Dutch paintings, with their old women scraping carrots with their work-worn hands. The art of fiction should be concerned, says the narrator, with the faithful representing of commonplace things. That's Adam Bede, chapter 17. This new novelist was rather brave to enter the ranks with such a theory. She was rewarded by having readers accept it completely. They were delighted to find that such faithful representation of ordinary life did not imply a dull seriousness, a coat and waistcoat business, and that realistic presentation is perfectly compatible both with intellectual interest and with humour. You'll remember, those of you who know Adam Bede, I'm sure most of you do, the farmer's wife, Mrs. Poyser, is a marvel of sharp colloquial sayings in her interactions with her acquaintances. She won the distinction of being quoted in Parliament for one of her witty remarks. And the only fictional character before her who was so honoured to be quoted in Parliament was Sam Weller from Pickwick Papers. Anyway, she won this distinction, and at one point, she is very witty, at one point she mocks an egotistical neighbour for being like a cock which thinks the sun has risen on purpose to hear him crow. And at the harvest supper, which brings the novel to a close, Mrs. Poyser has an answer to the misogynistic bachelor, Bartle Massey. She tells him she knows what a man wants in a wife. He wants to make sure of one fool, as I'll tell him he's wise. But there's some men can do without that. They think so much of themselves already. And that's how it is, there's old bachelors. That's Mrs. Poyser telling Bartle Massey where to go. Well, all George Eliot's works show that literary realism, the representation of things as they are, need not be merely a matter of seeing and describing. It's compatible with intellectual, moral and philosophical observation and opinion, judgment. One of the best of George Eliot's contemporary critics, Leslie Stephen, father of Virginia Woolf, wrote admiringly in his monograph on George Eliot in 1902 that it may safely be said that no novelist of mark ever possessed a wider intellectual culture. It's quite interesting that this early book on George Eliot, 1902, appeared in a series, English Men of Letters. It's an accolade in its way. Stephen believed, however, that the works she published after her third novel, Silas Marner, in 1861, that the works after that were spoilt to some extent by the very intellectualism he admired. In Middlemarch, 1871-2, he finds her philosophical and scientific language intrusive. He misses the simple charm of the earlier works. Now, as is well known, Virginia Woolf helped to resurrect Middlemarch from extraordinary critical neglect in an article in 1919 on the centenary of George Eliot's birth. Woolf famously calls Middlemarch the magnificent book which, with all its imperfections, is one of the few English novels written for grown-up people. It's rather marvellous in Times Literary Supplement, November 1919. Although we might note here that Virginia Woolf, always a shrewd critic, but always takes rather a high and mighty attitude. And here, she talks about all its imperfections, but she doesn't tell us what they are. So she gives praise, but she won't lavish it. So we don't know what the imperfections are, but we do know that Virginia Woolf admires Middlemarch, and she is to be credited with bringing Middlemarch back into the sunlight of critical opinion. in 1919. What Leslie Stephen and his daughter Virginia Woolf both appreciate in George Eliot's novels, especially Middlemarch, is the intelligence of her judgments, her art of reflecting on characters and events. As I've hinted already, these are the qualities, in particular, the humour, of course, but the judgments and the reflecting are the qualities most admired by Alan Hollinghurst and many other modern novelists, and I've documented Martin Amis, A.S. Byatt, Julian Barnes, Zadie Smith, I mean all the very big writers that we know of. They've all said something similar about Middlemarch and about George Eliot. Now, Leslie Stephen, sticking with him for a moment, greatly admired the presentation of the relationship between Lydgate and Rosamond in Middlemarch. Henry James also gave the painful fireside scenes between the couple the highest praise. James says, "There's nothing more powerfully real than these scenes in all English fiction, and nothing certainly more intelligent." This is an article in 1873. Well, James is right. George Eliot not only tells us about, she does tell us, and this is what she's telling us, about that total missing of each other's mental track, which is too evidently possible even between persons who are continually thinking of each other. But she avoids seeming too omniscient in two ways. One way is by sharing this intelligent thought process with Lydgate himself. It's a moment of recognition by him of the unhappiness of his marriage and the reasons for it. But George Eliot's brilliance here is not only just that she shares her own brilliance with a very intelligent doctor, an innovative, researching doctor, medical man, but it's also, the brilliance here is more complex because as she weaves in and out of his self-analysis, she still leaves him with his egotism and his arrogance, or at least some of it. So the arrogance that he's brought to this marriage, showing that his realisation, his self-analysis, his self-knowledge is only partial, human, all too human, and not a superhuman leap into full understanding. It's another aspect, is it not, of her realism, her psychological realism. And the best chapter this is in chapter 58, which is the best chapter in the novel for looking at the extraordinary way in which she details the painful, amusing but painful relationship between Lydgate and Rosamond. Well, a few pages further on in this marvellous chapter, having told us about the missing of each other's mental track, she shows the workings in a painful scene when Lydgate comes home from work, tired and worried about the debts that they have racked up in furnishing their new home, their new marital home. He means to be gentle in telling Rosamond the bad news about the debts. But, irritated by her lack of desire to get involved in the question, he bursts out with it, telling her of a large debt which has been pressing on me a good while, and in fact we are getting deeper every day, for people don't pay me the faster because others want the money. I took pains to keep it from you when you were not well, but now we must think together about it, and you must help me. You could hear he's telling her what she has to do. To this, Rosamond replies, famously, "What can I do, Tertius?" The narrator comments, not too much, but she comments on this thin utterance and how it falls like a mental chill on Lydgate's roused tenderness. A mortal chill. No wonder Henry James marvelled at these scenes. Thomas Keneally, author of Schindler's Ark, wrote in the Sunday Times in 2013 that Middlemarch is the template for all novels about relationships. It's never been outthought or outwritten. I agree. I think that's absolutely the case. Well, Leslie Stephen too admires George Eliot's skill in setting out some of the moral and intellectual processes which we can all understand. She's singularly powerful in describing the conflicts of emotions, the ingenious modes of self-deception which most of us employ. On the other hand, he thinks that there's here and there too much explicit psychological analysis, and that for all George Eliot's powers of wit, she offers a rather melancholy view of life in general. Now, this opinion has been fairly widely shared by readers, and particularly with reference to Middlemarch. Well, is he right? Does she take a rather melancholy view of life? Let's take up some of the points. George Eliot's concern with moral and intellectual processes, her psychological analysis, her powerful descriptions of the conflicts of emotions, and what Stephen believes to be her melancholy view of life. Now, here's where a consideration of her conclusions in the sense of judgments is required. Conclusions in the sense of practical endings will come in too. For the particular outcomes of a novel, who marries whom, who dies, who loses his money, who succeeds in her aspirations, who has to accept a life rather less adventurous than had been expected or hoped for, that kind of thing, these conclusions, these particular narrative outcomes inevitably suggest a particular interpretation. The way the novelist chooses to end his or her novel seems to suggest an inevitability about that particular ending. The writer appears to be offering a final judgment on the characters, to be making the choice of ending according to his or her philosophical and moral view of life. Now, I say appears to be, and of course, in a sense, that's what the novelist is doing, but I'm trying to look a little bit behind this. But many novelists, and particularly in the 18th and early 19th centuries, choose deliberately to end their novels by giving prizes to the good characters and punishments to the bad. And so they do this because they know that part of the reader's pleasure is bound up with the satisfaction offered by such poetic justice. Jane Austen quite often does this. For example, in Mansfield Park, she begins her final chapter of doling out destinies by declaring explicitly what she's about to do. Let other pens dwell on guilt and misery. I quit such odious subjects as soon as I can, impatient to restore everybody not greatly in fault themselves to tolerable comfort, and have done with all the rest. She proceeds, if you remember, to restore her heroine Fanny Price to her rightful place in the Bertram household, namely its centre, not the periphery, where Fanny Price has languished for the whole of the novel up to the end. Jane Austen has the head of the house, Sir Thomas Bertram, realise and rectify his mistakes. And most satisfying of all, the two nastiest characters, Mrs. Norris and her niece Maria, are sent off to a remote and private place where, shut up together with little society, on one side no affection, on the other no judgment, it may be reasonably supposed that their tempers became their mutual punishment. Dickens, too, often finishes by distributing prizes and punishments. Oliver Twist is a good example. The philanthropist Mr. Brownlow adopts the orphan Oliver, and the Bumbles satisfyingly become paupers in the very workhouse they once presided over with such cruelty, where, of course, Oliver very famously asked for more. By contrast, though, George Eliot felt that as a realist novelist, she couldn't allow herself the luxury of always rewarding her favourite and punishing the characters of whom she disapproved. Her reason was straightforward. She expressed it while she was still Marian Evans, translator from German and Latin, and journalist in the Westminster Review. She expressed this a few years before she attempted fiction. In life, she says, virtue is not always rewarded and vice punished. In literature, then, a writer, particularly one who wishes to be realistic, is not really pointing a moral when he or she reaches for, I'm quoting now, for the so-called moral denouement, in which rewards and punishments are distributed according to those notions of justice on which the novel writer would have recommended that the world should be governed if he had been consulted at the creation. The emotional satisfaction which a reader feels when the villain of the book dies of some hideous disease or is crushed by a railway train is no more essentially moral than the satisfaction which used to be felt in whipping culprits at the cart tail. Now, she doesn't say so, but I'm pretty sure that when she's talking about the villain being crushed by a railway train, she's thinking of the evil Mr. Carker in Dickens's Dombey and Son of 1848. Now, this is in an article called The Morality of Wilhelm Meister. And what it means is that she understands and shares the reader's feeling of satisfaction at such moments of poetic justice, while at the same time declining to think that that feeling is morally admirable. And what she, I think, would like to get from readers is a sense of, yes, enjoy the moment when we can have this schadenfreude about what happens to the baddie, but note at the same time, have a little bit of self-knowledge at the same time. That's not actually a very positively moral point of view to have, and perhaps just take a slightly more complicated view of the matter. That's, I think, what's in her mind. So when she turned to writing fiction herself, beginning with Scenes of Clerical Life in 1858, she followed Goethe, whom she'd been writing about in this article. And she praised Goethe for showing in his novel Wilhelm Meister tolerance of mistakes and sympathy for mixed and erring and self-deluding humanity. In another article entitled The Natural History of German Life, written in 1856, shortly before she took the plunge into fiction writing herself, she strikes out with a manifesto. The greatest benefit we owe to the artist, whether painter, poet or novelist, she writes, is the extension of our sympathies. She goes on to claim that imaginative literature can do more than sermons and philosophical dissertations to forge links between human beings. Art is the nearest thing to life, she writes. It's a mode of amplifying experience and extending our contact with our fellow men beyond the bounds of our personal lot. And here she's making a claim for art, whatever kind of art it might be, as a guide to human interaction, as an opening of sympathies and imaginations and sensitivities. Almost the last essay she wrote before giving up journalism and starting novel writing herself is the witty Silly Novels by Lady Novelists, which was published in October 1856. In this essay, she dismisses some recently published novels, not by Charlotte Bronte and Mrs. Gaskell and writers whom she admired, but by completely unknown then and now female writers whom she did actually get to know, and she quotes some of their writing. It's extremely amusing, really, how bad they are. So it's bad novels, but by ladies in this case. She says, she dismisses these novels with their ludicrously perfect heroines, examples of the ideal woman in feelings, faculties and flounces. Her eyes and her wit, the typical heroine, her eyes and her wit are both dazzling. Her nose and her morals are alike free from any tendency to irregularity. She has a superb contralto and a superb intellect. She's perfectly well dressed and perfectly religious. She dances like a sylph and reads the Bible in the original tongues. In her recorded conversations, she's amazingly eloquent, and in her unrecorded conversations, amazingly witty. Well, here she's having her fun at the expense of some really bad novels, as I said, and they tend to be characterised by ludicrous plot lines and stilted dialogue between characters who give you no sense that anybody has ever imagined them as characters. Here in this article, this last article that she wrote before starting writing herself, she ends, quite boldly really, for somebody who hadn't started yet, by suggesting what a novel should be. And she says, like crystalline masses, it may take any form and yet be beautiful. We have only to pour in the right elements: genuine observation, humour and passion. Well, her narrators, when she gets going really, tread a difficult path. They direct the reader's attention towards certain opinions and judgments, of course they do. However, they try to do so in a spirit of openness and sometimes even of ambivalence. So that the lesson one learns is not so much that this or that opinion is the correct one, but rather that attempting to come to a judgment, a conclusion, if you like, is necessary, but at the same time difficult. And that arriving at a conclusion is in some cases well nigh impossible. In that famous chapter 17 of Adam Bede, in which the story pauses a little, the narrator turns directly to us readers, daring us to object to her portrayal of the clergyman Mr. Irwin as less than saintly. How much more edifying it would have been, she imagines us complaining, if you had made him give Arthur Nuneaton, some truly spiritual advice. You might have put into his mouth the most beautiful things, quite as good as reading a sermon. To which the narrator's robust reply is, certainly I could, if I were a clever novelist, not obliged to creep servilely after nature and fact, but able to represent things as they never have been and never will be. Then, of course, my characters would be entirely of my own choosing, and I could select the most unexceptionable type of clergyman and put my own admirable opinions into his mouth on all occasions. But you must have perceived long ago that I have no such lofty vocation, and that I aspire to give no more than a faithful account of men and things as they have mirrored themselves in my mind. The mirror is doubtless defective. The outlines will sometimes be disturbed, the reflection faint or confused. But I feel as much bound to tell you, as precisely as I can, what that reflection is, as if I were in the witness box narrating my experience on oath. I don't think you would ever have seen a paragraph like this in any novel ever written before Adam Bede burst on the scene. It is so different from every other novel. I mean, I haven't read every other novel, but every other novel I have read or could think of, it is so different. And the complexity and multiplicity of tone here is striking. Though it's written in pseudo-apologetic language, if I were a clever novelist, if I could do this, if I could do that, it's actually, of course, a claim to superiority, because she's busy saying, I don't want to be presiding over a piece of literature which doesn't tell the truth, which isn't factual, which isn't correct in some way. An obvious untruth, the suggestion that she's not free to write about characters entirely of her own choosing. Of course she is. She's chosen her characters, she does it. But that obvious untruth is cleverly put to use in the service of a greater truth, namely that the only real vocation is to give a faithful account of men and things. Although she then goes on to say how difficult it is to do that with a defective mirror of one mind. And I think that the playful ironies of this passage resolve themselves at the end, really. You can see that, into a serious commitment, as if a witness in a witness box, a serious commitment to offering truths as if on oath, while at the same time being aware that there will be mistakes, there will be omissions. It won't be perfect, since nobody can see everything whole, no one person. And here, I think often happens in George Eliot's work, a single paragraph can accommodate several tonal shifts of irony and sympathy before settling on what is here a surprising note, either funny or serious or both. And a prime example of this comes in the opening chapter of Middlemarch, with the fine paragraph beginning, "And how should Dorothea not marry?" Here Dorothea's marriage prospects are discussed by both narrator and other characters. And how should Dorothea not marry? A girl so handsome and with such prospects. Nothing could hinder it but her love of extremes and her insistence on regulating life according to notions which might cause a wary man to hesitate before he made her an offer. A young lady of some birth and fortune, who knelt suddenly down by the side of a sick labourer and prayed fervently as if she thought herself living in the time of the apostles, who had strange whims of fasting like a papist and of sitting up at night to read old theological books. Such a wife might awaken you some fine morning with a new scheme for the application of her income, which would interfere with political economy and the keeping of saddle horses. A man would naturally think twice before he risked himself in such fellowship. Sane people did what their neighbours did, so that if any lunatics were at large, one might know and avoid them. And here the paragraph turns the reader's thoughts from the oddities of this young woman, with her strange whims, her lack of knowledge of the world, towards recognising her human potential for goodness and kindness, and at the same time turning a critical eye on the complacent, selfish superiority of any man who might wish to marry and subdue her. So the paragraph again, I think, merits close attention, is another example of what she can do with a paragraph. Well, this is how George Eliot's narrators proceed in the matter of coming to judgments. They're strong-minded, they're clever, they're insistent sometimes and persuasive often, but they do allow for doubts and errors and gaps in knowledge. In fact, the predominating narrative tone is often one of ambivalence, or at least a tendency to look at life from every point of view, and to think in terms of paradoxes such as the one she quotes from Aristotle's Poetics in the epigraph to a chapter of Daniel Deronda. And this is from Aristotle. It is a part of probability that many improbable things will happen. And that's very clever when you think about it. Part of probability that many improbable things will happen. So she's not going to take the idea of being utterly realistic to a complete extreme, the extreme of boredom, in other words, or sameness. She is going to show you that even unexpected things, improbable things, can come within the bounds of the allowable, of the achievable, of the factual. That's what she does in her novels. She does it particularly, I think, in Daniel Deronda, when Gwendolen is in the boat with her hated husband Grandcourt, and Grandcourt falls, slips, is pushed out of the boat. That's a place where I can see this happening. Anyway, the desire to analyse and to find answers is in a state of tension in her novels, with the recognition of this difficulty of coming to a proper conclusion. The pervasive irony of the narrative tone, however, allows for some omniscience, but it's simultaneously questioning. One famous, you will know this, authorial scientific analogy in Middlemarch looks at first glance like a piece of omniscience of teaching. And it reminds us of the passage already quoted from Adam Bede about the narrator's mind being a doubtless defective mirror. If the narrator's mind is such, then so is everybody's mind. And this is from chapter 27 of Middlemarch. Your pier glass, or extensive surface of polished steel, made to be brought by a housemaid, would be minutely and multitudinously scratched in all directions. But placed now against it a lighted candle as a centre of illumination, and lo, the scratches will seem to arrange themselves in a fine series of concentric circles round that little sun. It is demonstrable that the scratches are going everywhere impartially, and it is only your candle which produces the flattering illusion of a concentric arrangement, its light falling with an exclusive optical selection. These things are a parable. The scratches are events, and the candle is the egoism of any person now absent, of Miss Vincy, for example, Rosamond. Well, this is elaborate and insistent, and it bangs on a bit. These things are a parable. She's really definitely telling us what we are to think here. But the certainty that appears to accompany the extended metaphor of the pier glass, the polished surface, and the candle, is actually partly an illusion, as she says. Science is to be respected, of course, but what it teaches here is actually the relativity of things. The candle concentrates the scratches in a circle, but it does so by means of a flattering illusion. Rosamond Vincy's egoism is represented by the candle, but the illumination it offers is faulty. So illumination, which isn't entirely illuminating, in other words. In this case, the mistake is Rosamond's entirely understandable belief that Lydgate's fallen in love with her, and she with him. What follows in relation to the two of them is the complicated business of mutual sexual attraction. The narrator observes the watchful idea on Rosamond's part that she and Lydgate are as good as engaged, and that he will be the perfect husband for her, not only in terms of emotion and physicality, but also he will be perfect as a new reforming medical man in the town of Middlemarch. He will be suitable for her social aspirations as well. But Lydgate, who isn't thinking of marrying but wants to go on with his medical researches and do good work and found hospitals and all that kind of thing, which of course do not happen in the novel, he has a counter idea, writes the narrator, which however is doomed, since according to the narrator, employing another scientific metaphor, his counter idea lies blind and unconcerned as a jellyfish which gets melted without knowing it. So of course he ends up engaged to Rosamond. Science here provides a useful vocabulary to describe and analyse the situation, but it doesn't resolve the problem created by the conflict between Rosamond's idea and Lydgate's. Well, such conflicts and the difficulty of making judgments on them occur throughout Middlemarch. Early on, Dorothea Brooke mistakes Mr. Casaubon's gravity and humorlessness for wide learning, which she believes he will generously share with her when they marry. The narrator points out that signs are small measurable things, but interpretations are illimitable, and in girls of sweet, ardent nature, every sign is apt to conjure up wonder, hope, belief vast as a sky, and coloured by a diffused thimbleful of matter in the shape of knowledge. The power of George Eliot's use of metaphor here is that they can be picked up later in the novel. Once Dorothea is actually married to her middle-aged clergyman, middle-aged, not old, 46. I've worked this out. We've had arguments about this with other George Eliot scholars, but often we think of him as an old man. She's 19 when they marry, admittedly, so there's 27 years difference. And it's Mr. Brooke who tells us that there's a 27-year difference. So Casaubon is 46 when they marry, not 66 or 86. She's marrying her middle-aged clergyman, and she finds that life with him is not vast as a sky or full of large vistas and wide fresh air, but rather like being stuck in winding passages which seem to lead nowhere. The opposite. Interpretations are illimitable, says George Eliot, and they are also for other characters and for narrators. Her aim is to avoid any pretense of certainty, while not falling into complete scepticism about what can be known. For that, too, is to become morally and intellectually paralysed, she thinks. Her narrators certainly, as we've seen, do have opinions, and they believe their opinions to be right, and their aim is to persuade readers to share these opinions, but they know that no one opinion is likely to be completely correct. Now here George Eliot is following the 18th century empirical philosopher David Hume. In the conclusion to the first book of his Treatise of Human Nature, Hume confesses that his analysis of the reasoning faculty and his discovery of the impossibility of reaching certainty about our ideas has led him into a wilderness. He's shunned by his fellow thinkers, he says, for denying their certainties. But then he can no longer accept their arguments about reason, the soul, God, or the afterlife, all those big questions. He can't accept their arguments, but nor can he consign himself to the position of absolute skeptic. He says, where reason fails, nature steps in and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse, and am merry with my friends. He's able to forget in the act of living the philosophical impasse to which he has brought his subject. And he finishes by saying that a true skeptic will be diffident of his philosophical doubts as well as of his philosophical convictions. In other words, he'll be sceptical of his own scepticism. Goethe also tackled this problem in an aphorism about tätiges Skepsis, active scepticism. The phrase suggests that doubt must be prepared to turn its questioning on itself. You don't just doubt what other people think, you could doubt your own doubting. And Thomas Henry Huxley, interestingly, quotes this Goethe phrase, tätiges Skepsis, in his very important review in the Times of Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. Huxley explains it. It is doubt which so loves the truth that it neither dares rest in doubting nor extinguish itself by unjustified belief. So you mustn't doubt too much, but you mustn't believe too much either, because even the doubting of a dogma could be itself a dogma. And this, I think, is George Eliot's position as narrator. As she observes in chapter 23 of Middlemarch, though distrust was your only clue when negotiating the sale of a horse with a wily horse dealer, as young Fred Vincy finds himself doing, nonetheless, she says, scepticism, as we know, can never be thoroughly applied, else life would come to a standstill. It's human nature to strive for conclusions, for answers to problems, but we must accept that answers will often elude us. As for conclusions in the sense of endings, George Eliot thought about these early in her career as a novelist. In 1859, when she was writing her first stories, The 3 Scenes of Clerical Life, longish novellas, which were published by John Blackwood in 1857, 1858, she was writing to her, when she was writing these, her publisher, John Blackwood, wrote to her life partner, G.H. Lewis, complaining mildly that George Eliot, the name that he'd been given for this new author, huddles up the conclusion of his stories too much. Now at this point, Blackwood did not know the identity or the gender of the George Eliot he was being introduced to by Lewis. Everything was done through Lewis, and whom he, Blackwood, would soon be unleashing upon the public with the hugely successful Adam Bede. He didn't at this point know. So George Eliot himself replies directly the following day to Blackwood, saying, "I pay attention to your caution about the danger of huddling up my stories." She adds, however, that conclusions are the weak point of most authors, but some of the fault lies in the very nature of a conclusion, which is at best a negation. Well, it's an interesting remark, I think, and I suppose she meant that in putting a stop to the lives of her imagined figures, she necessarily put an end also to any new hopes or plans or that they might have found if she carried on for longer. I mean, when do you stop your novel? How far on do you go with your characters and what they're doing and what they're thinking and what happens to them? Like so many authors, including those that she chastised for giving out prizes and punishments, she did often add an epilogue or a finale or a conclusion in which she gives the reader a privileged glimpse of the afterlives of the characters. Now she can do this in all her novels except Daniel Deronda. Daniel Deronda is set in the present time. All her other novels are set back in the past, and so she can imagine a more recent past when her characters have grown up a bit and things are happening to them. But unlike others, she did strive for realism or probability in her summings up. Many readers of Middlemarch, as it was coming out in bi-monthly parts in 1871 and 72, wished for the two main protagonists, the admirable but flawed idealists Dorothea Casaubon and Dr. Tertius Lydgate, both unhappily married. Readers wished for them to come together in a happy ending of second chances. And I think new readers today also probably still hope for this outcome. These are the two most likeable and most interesting and most concentrated on characters, and we would like them to come together. But George Eliot, she could have done, of course, but she doesn't give in to the temptation here. Dorothea is given a second chance, a second bite at marital happiness after the death of Mr. Casaubon, but not with Lydgate. And I think it's interesting, as a reader of Middlemarch, to ask the question, how is it that she manages to reward her heroine, as Jane Austen often does rather more openly, while still insisting that in life virtue isn't always rewarded nor vice punished? And yet we don't object in Dorothea's case. I think it's partly because Dorothea is shown in great detail to suffer from her marriage and also from jealousy and envy, and to overcome that and to make a kind of moral leap in a way, not a leap but a step in advance. And so in a sense she is being rewarded, but you see in a moment, it's even George Eliot doesn't think that she doesn't give Dorothea a sort of riding into the sunset with only happiness in front of her future. And I'm coming towards the end, so I'll see that. I'll talk about that in a moment. But she does undoubtedly, to a certain extent, reward Dorothea, whereas Lydgate, poor Lydgate, gets no second chance, and he's doomed to carry on faithfully with Rosamond, dropping his early hopes of becoming a pioneer in medical research. And then even Dorothea, although George Eliot does grant her a happy married future, she's described in the finale in terms which are not exactly optimistic. Many who knew her thought it a pity that so substantive and rare a creature should have been absorbed into the life of another and be known only in a certain circle as a wife and mother. And that's the kind of remark that Leslie Stephen had in mind when he wrote a George Eliot's rather melancholy view of life. But we should note that it's given here as a view of many who knew her, not necessarily as the narrator's own opinion. And the final paragraph of the novel takes a balanced view of Dorothea's contribution to humanity. Reflecting the influence of Feuerbach and Spinoza with their philosophies of sympathy, the narrator achieves even-handedness through seesawing between positives and negatives, until she settles on what we might term a not unhappy judgment in relation to Dorothea. The very last sentences of the novel read as follows. Her finely touched spirit had still its fine issues, though they were not widely visible. Her full nature, like that river of which Cyrus broke the strength, spent itself in channels which had no great name on earth. But the effect of her being on those around her was incalculably diffusive. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. Well, it's another of those paragraphs that needs a lot of unpicking. Read it again. Negatives, you've got a lot of negatives there. Not widely visited, no great name, unhistoric acts, hidden life, unvisited tombs. And these negatives alternate with positives. Finely touched spirit, fine issues, full nature, the growing good of the world, lived faithfully. And also with words and phrases which are ambivalent, half negative, half positive. But the effect, incalculably diffusive, partly dependent, that things are not so ill with you and me, half owing. This philosophical outlook is neither pessimistic nor optimistic, though George Eliot certainly might have been more optimistic without sacrificing realism altogether. She could, of course, have had Dorothy and Lydgate, if not come together in a new marriage. They could have come together as they were hoping to do, with her money and his expertise to build the new fever hospital he was hoping to do. But no, that doesn't happen. Nonetheless, George Eliot isn't entirely pessimistic. She herself described her philosophy of life in a letter in 1877 to a psychologist, James Sully. She described her philosophy of life as meliorism, the belief that the world is neither the best nor the worst of all possible worlds, but that it may be improved up to a point and suffering may be alleviated, at least in part, by human effort. And it's to stop falling into that paralysis of scepticism. There is nothing we can do, therefore we will do nothing. You've got to try. So the very novelist who seems at first glance to wish to offer definite explanations of processes, of human motivation and of historical phenomena is actually equally keen to give due place to the mystery of human relations and outcomes. She reaches for conclusions just as many of her characters do, but she recognises that they may not always be clear and may not always be achievable. They sometimes lie beyond reach. And just very finally, study of conclusions does mean focusing on last words, perhaps, last sentences, last paragraphs. And George Eliot's novels can offer an instructive insight into the problems she knew accompanied final words, as did also her fellow novelists, Dickens, Thackeray, Charlotte Bronte, Mrs. Gaskell. They all worried about their endings and often changed them, couldn't quite decide on the final tone. Some of the epilogues to George Eliot's novels conclude with a short piece of speech by one of the characters. These tend to be rather flat and anticlimactic, but I think deliberately so, because I think George Eliot, in going beyond the action of the story proper, doesn't want to abandon the avowed theory and practice of offering realism in her fiction. And so she chooses a rather quiet depiction of ongoing everyday life. Adam Bede is typical here. The epilogue there ends with Dinah, married to Adam and the mother of 2 young children, addressing Adam when he comes home from work. "Come in, Adam, and rest. It has been a hard day for thee." It's a bit flat, it's a bit soft, but I think she thinks that's better than anything more rousing or sentimental or dramatic. She doesn't want to start a drama when she's got to the end of the novel. Middlemarch, of course, is different. It's got the longest and the most reflective philosophical finale of all the novels. And as we've seen, it embodies the merest view of life embraced by its author. We know that George Eliot had difficulties coming to her conclusion here. She made various changes to the text in the conclusion in order to avoid the traps of excessive optimism or excessive pessimism. They've already looked at the marvellous final paragraph she decided on, seeing how it holds the pros and cons of Dorothea's future life in precarious but decent balance. So while in one sense all conclusions are, like Samuel Johnson's to his philosophical fiction Rasselas, a conclusion in which nothing is concluded, George Eliot's conclusion to Middlemarch says the same thing and yet makes a safe and to many readers a satisfactory landing just this side of pessimism.
Thank you, Rosemary. That was wonderful, and it's given us a lot to think about. My word. I'm sure you're happy to accept questions or discussion points. Anybody like to start with?
Yes, I think it's interesting that George Eliot is more realistic than say Dickens, but I wonder that she started like Dickens, like Nicholas Nickleby and Oliver Twist, Martin Chuzzlewit, when the heroes ride off into marry their love of their life, get rich, marry off, ride off into the sunset. He was in his 20s, but I think when he sort of got to George Eliot, say in his 40s, a bit more blurred, hard times, little Dorrit, great expectations, it's not so happy anymore. It's just a thought, where she started late.
That's a very good point.
She was ahead of it,
Yeah, it's entirely true. And actually, Great Expectations is the Dickens novel I had in mind about endings, because he couldn't decide whether we're supposed to hope perhaps that Pip and Estella might get together, or whether it's completely, talk about improbable and impossible. And it's his friend Bulwer Lytton who made him change it to make it seem a bit more, it's actually still ambivalent at the end, but it's a bit more positive. Look, it could be more positive than otherwise it might be. And I'm a great fan of Dickens, I think he's wonderful, but you have to admit that the problem there, in terms of relationships, which George Eliot's so good at, usually at any rate, is that Pip is wonderfully, it's a first-person narrated novel, and it's wonderful the way Dickens gets the grown-up Pip to give you the feeling of the young Pip, while at the same time looking back and recognising the mistakes the young Pip made. It's kind of double vision there. It's not a single one that, like the one that George Eliot wants us to avoid. It's terrific. But the problem is Estella. She's a nothing. She's just an idea. She's not a character. She can't be because of the plot, the fairy tale aspect of the plot, which itself is hugely interesting. But you've got a problem if you've got a real person, as it were. I don't know. Does anybody else disagree with me? Does anybody agree with me on that? I don't know. That's just that's my view anyway. But I agree with what you say about the earlier novels being more likely to abide by that pattern of happy endings and so on.
I was thinking of Estella is the object of an infatuation, so she doesn't have to be that real, but it's what Pip has made of her. But he finds that she's an absolutely essential part of his life. You can't imagine life without her. But this is all projection onto maybe a blank screen. But I don't think it matters too much that the screen is blank, really.
Well, that's a good point.
Power of his hopeless infatuation.
Yes, true. That's it. She's a creature of his imagination. Yes, and you're right about that. But of course, that's still a problem if he's trying to imagine a future for them.
Yes, well, it's so carefully
edged
round that it leaves us. At one point, he actually said, "I saw the shadow of no parting from her," which means the opposite of what he's trying to say.
Yes, and that's the ending he came up with, having tried it various ways, hadn't he? And then talked to Bulwer Lytton, who
No, I think the final one, I saw no shadow of her.
Yes, that's right. I saw no shadow.
Before that, he actually wrote the shadow of no parting from her.
Yes, that's right.
Trapped in this awful.
That's right.
Thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you've got that more clearly in your head than I have. So there.
But about the George Eliot thing, I wondered how much in this open-minded skepticism that you were, I think, absolutely correctly sort of focusing on, does free and direct discourse play a crucial role in that? I mean, like in that great "Why Should Dorothea Not Marry?"
Yes.
Paragraph.
Yes.
I mean, it sort of shifts, doesn't it, from the point of
Yes.
view from which things are being shown,
Yes.
from a sort of reasonable, well, she's a bit extreme, isn't she, to, in fact, a sort of bigoted middle-class man who just is only worried about his BMW or his saddle horses, whatever
Yes.
it is. So, you know, you're lured in to think, oh, well, yeah, she's...
Yes.
But then at the end,
Yes.
all the sympathy comes back to Dorothea. And that keeps the whole business of judgment suspended in a way, isn't it? And I wonder whether free indirect style is one way in which she does that a lot.
It is, absolutely. It is weaving in and out of heads without telling you all the time which head she's in, or whether she's in a particular head, or whether, yes, that's absolutely right. It is, you're right, it's a way of extending this openness that I was talking about. Yeah. Yes.
Rosemary, you began by making a distinction between endings and conclusions. A little while ago, some of us saw a production called The Great Middlemarch Mystery, produced by Dash Arts. And that was really Middlemarch without Dorothea. And it was a teasing out of Bulstrode's connection with Ladislaw's mother and so forth, and also Lydgate's predicament and what happens with the hospital. And I found myself wondering whether, despite everything you've been saying, whether she was still attracted to a plot where she tied up the ends, because that's what Dash Arts production showed, how she did that, which was quite separate from the wider kinds of conclusions that you've been talking so eloquently about.
Yes. Well, I mean, novelists do have to tie up ends, don't they? I mean, that was partly what I was saying, that when she does that thing in Adam Bede, if I were a clever novelist, I would do this, I would be able to choose. And I did say, well, of course she's choosing, and of course at every point she's choosing, and at every point she's deciding how best to tie it up. And of course, since the Victorian novel, there have been novels which choose, perhaps cleverly, not to tie anything up, to leave everything open. And actually, contemporary with her, Charlotte Bronte does that in Villette. It's quite extraordinary. The ending of Villette is absolutely gobsmacking. With the beloved Mr. Emmanuel in the boat, coming over in the ship, coming over to join Lucy Snow. She spent 3 years starting up her school, waiting for him to come over, and it's told in the first person, of course, so she's telling us what's happening, and she's in the moment at the very end. He's on the ship. Oh, but we hear about storms, and will he make it? Well, of course, I mean, it's extraordinary. It's not possible to be in that frame of mind, and yet it is. I think that's another way of doing it. That's very unusual, isn't it?
Yes, but we think, don't we, that George Eliot was also influenced by Villette.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yeah. But I mean, I would always say that George Eliot she does reach after conclusions, and she does, worry about them and want to reach, and I suppose most people would, and she does lecture and teach us and so on. So I'm not saying that everybody who's always thought she was a didactic author, they're all wrong. That's not the case. I think what I've been trying to say is that it's rather more subtle than that, and that in a sense she knows that is a difficulty, and to some extent she fights against it. That would be another way of trying to talk about the subject, would be to try to look more into the battles that she might have had psychologically, knowing that she was inclined to be critical and inclined to be judgmental, in fact. That's another way of doing it.
do you think that sometimes the judgments that are passed are sort of misleading? Like the famous one about Lydgate, that the distinction of mind that was evident in his scientific studies did not penetrate his feeling and judgment about furniture and women.
Yes.
His thoughts of commoners.
Yes.
Actually, I suppose that might be true, but it's not in fact what shapes him up to the average, is it, in the end?
No.
Because what really brings him down is his warm-heartedness when, Rosamond bursts into tears. He's...
Well, he gets himself engaged. This is the jellyfish, so being squashed. He gets himself engaged because she's got beautiful blue eyes and tears. And of course, and George Eliot's quite hard on him. His idea of an ideal woman is, that she should be beautiful, blue-eyed, and with sentiment and with emotion. But he doesn't reckon with her extraordinary selfishness, but it's not just selfishness, but generally she's a much stronger figure in a way than certainly he. And so but that's what she's doing, isn't it? She sees him and she sees his spots of commonness, how he's not as good at reading female human nature as he is at reading physiological tracts or whatever it might be. But then nobody would be, would they? we all get it wrong physically, and she does. This is what I think she is so good at. He falls in love with her. They're physically attracted. They can't help it. And yet she's wrong for him. Well, now we've seen that, have we not, in life?
I'm not arguing with it. Of its realism. I'm just saying that there's that early judgment passed on him, which you think, this is going to be crucial.
I see, yes.
Well,
yes.
Actually, it's not quite crucial, is it? Because it's actually the good side of Lydgate, the compassionate, warm-hearted, doctoring side that actually lures him into the fatal trap.
Well, it lures him, but I suppose what she says is true of his, once he's in the trap, of his demeanour when he's in the trap, because he does, he does shut her down. It takes him a while to realise that life for her isn't very exciting or interesting or happy. And so I don't think I quite agree with you that the falling in love, as it were, and the becoming engaged is a mistake. But I don't think that means that there isn't more to come to fulfil the prophecy that the narrator makes. What I don't think is very good is the backward look at his time in Paris. Of course he had to be in Paris because Paris was the place where the stethoscope was discovered and where people were allowed to cut up corpses and all the things that were not allowed here. So it was the place for the future of medicine. But there's a sort of falling in love with the actress, the singer-actress thing, the deaths and dramas there, which that's not my favourite part of Middlemarch. It doesn't seem quite to be...
Well, it's on a different level of reality, isn't it?
Yes.
She's straight into the world of Balzac, I think.
Yes, exactly, Balzac, that's right.
So do you think there's an equality of disappointment with Lydgate and Dorothea?
Is there an
equality of disappointment between the two, is it?
I see. Between, you mean Dorothy? Or between
Lydgate.
Lydgate and Rosamond, or Lydgate and Dorothea?
Yeah.
Which?
Two of them, they both fail.
You mean, yes, they do. They do. They do. And I think, again, it's interesting. Lydgate feels, yes. And George Eliot doesn't say he feels because of his faults of character, but of course they're part of it, and part of it's just bad luck, and part of it, of course, the whole thing with Bulstrode, the reason Lydgate is disgraced in Middlemarch is that he has got entangled with Bulstrode because Bulstrode's going to support the hospital, and then of course there becomes a kind of moral entanglement there. But I don't think... Dorothea, I think George Eliot hasn't I'm not sure whether she decided herself how much Dorothea really is rewarded for being a positive character.
I mean, they both had high-minded aspirations, didn't they?
Yeah, yes. Well, that's right. We don't hear. You see, she was going to be sort of building cottages for the poor, and we don't hear at the end that that's what she went on to do. And that's where I think George Eliot is quite probably thinking, as she says, many thought that it was a shame she was only a wife and mother. And I think that a bit of that is George Eliot thinking it too.
I think she's very realistic, like Mr. Fairbrother. I mean, Dickens would have had him meet someone else and marry, but he's so in love with Mary, it's heartrending the way he's in love with Mary. And in some ways would have been so much better than Fred Vincy, you know. And and could have had, he could have had her, but he doesn't, he's so Christ-like, in his way. And, he doesn't walk out, he doesn't ride into the sunset, but,
No.
and it's so realistic, I find it quite heartrending. I like him.
Well, there you are. I think you're speaking out of torn feelings, aren't you? And that's I think what she's interested in bringing out of us.
Yeah.
I'm always interested in names and titles, both of characters and of the novels themselves. Middlemarch. Whatever the main reason was for George Eliot choosing that title, what do you think of the theory of the subsidiary reason? That the middle of March, what do we know of that? It is the Ides of the month. And what must we do but beware of the Ides of March? So my question is, of what should the modern reader beware in reading Middlemarch?
Well, that's really very attractive and interesting. Well, what should we beware of? Why do we have to beware as readers? I mean, we should be open to, curious and so on, but beware in the sense of something we should is dangerous to us in some way?
Possibly. Or what should we be looking out for?
Well, we have to look out for what we're encouraged to look out for by the book itself. I mean, we can't. I don't think you mean this. There's a thing that we should be looking out for in any novel we read. We open a novel, and it brings us into its world in a better or a worse way, or a more effective way, one way or another. And of course there are novels which are not realist novels which are wonderful, because they bring you into a context which isn't pretending to be, George Eliot, it's something different. But in terms of what we should be aware of, I suppose, I don't know, we have to be responsive, but we're allowed to be critical, obviously, as we read as well. I suppose I would want us to be aware of finding, as John did, finding that the writer, the narrator, him or herself, is not being true to him or herself in some way. I mean, I think over Lydgate it's true that there's a certain amount of fudging, or perhaps, I mean, I don't know, I've never written a novel. I wish I had. I only read them and criticise them, but actually it must be quite difficult. I have written other things, as we know, and so have many of you. It's jolly difficult to remember in chapter so-and-so or on page so-and-so what you actually said or thought, or how your mind was working in an earlier part of your writing, don't you think? And it's very hard to reconstruct how you came at a particular idea or a particular phrase. So how much more must that be the case with novels, and why are we so critical of a novel which seems perhaps to be inconsistent within itself in some way? Because it's just the human mind just works in inconsistencies, as well as, it might be, again, I think of it as a tempting consistency, but there being probably no perfection to be got in that respect. Do you see what you've set me off on something here I haven't thought about, but, I don't know. I suppose beware of disappointments, I suppose.
But it could be much more prosaic, but it's the middle of the country, it's the march.
Oh yes, I think you knew that, but what you meant was you were bringing out something that we hadn't all thought about. And indeed, I thought for a minute I was going to have to think, is there something about actual March in the month of March in the novel? There isn't, of course, but of course Adam Bede is full. Dates are extremely important in Adam Bede because it hit his pregnancy and it has to be measured. But it has to be measured through the seasons and through the weather and so on. But I mean that's not what you mean. You're just using the idea of the Ides of March as a
And was it in her mind, the author's mind?
Her life or her mind?
Was the phrase "the Ides of March"
Yes.
in George Eliot's mind, even tickling the back of it when she was choosing the title?
Who can tell? I would have thought not. But I mean, who on earth can tell?
And if it were, what would be the equivalent in the novel of a bunch of men with daggers under their
Well, that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. But I think we can be sure the usual thing, middle of the country, middle class mainly, or at least a movement towards the kind of middle class, the middlingness of the characters, which is part, of course, of the realism that I've been talking about. But you know that.
And the way they move in and out of Middlemarch.
Sorry?
A lot of people come and go.
Yes. That's true.
In the story. That could be the March bit, do you know?
Yes.
If you wanted to.
Oh yes. Well, that's true. That is true. They do. It's the sort of place where people will come in for certain reasons, then will leave for certain reasons. That's true.
I mean, this takes us into the complicated business of titles and pieces of art, whether they be books, whether they be paintings on the wall. And as a painter, I know how difficult that is to have a title. You don't start it with a title necessarily, and afterwards you think, golly, people want me to call it something. So there's a whole discussion, isn't there, about what do we call things?
Yes, that's true. That's right. Titles are difficult. They're very difficult. Because they would seem to lead you towards one particular point, whereas you may have a myriad other points that you don't want to be ignored.
I was interested, Rosemary, in the comments you made about meliorism.
Yes.
And I wonder myself whether she would write different. She would, obviously, but there's a sort of optimism in that meliorism.
Yes.
And I wondered what her attitude would be had she been writing in, say, the 1950s rather than the 1850s.
Yes, you think that that was a period, of course, without wars. A war was a distant memory. That's true. Where it wasn't in the 1950s. Is that what you were thinking
That's
of?
what
that
I was
sort
thinking.
of thing. The public life was.
Yes, and she's obviously aware of the history of the world, so she knows there's been bloodshed and
of course.
horrors.
Yes.
But that particular sort of obscenity of the two world wars,
yes.
I wonder whether that might have influenced her writing. I mean, there's no way of knowing.
Well, there's no way of knowing, but I would have thought it must have done because. But in ways that you can't foretell or you can't imagine or you can't be sure would have been the way it happened. But it can't not be the case. I mean, everybody lives in a context, a place, a time, and a grouping of some kind or other. And there's no way in which these things can't be a part of who you are and how you behave and what you think. But that doesn't mean to say that we're all the same, I'm a twin, but I'm very different from my twin. But we same, brought up in the same place, same time. Different.
And that the chapter 17 in Adam B, which is wonderful, really, isn't it? With the way in which she just stops and has this aside.
Yes.
But it's foreshadowed in Adam B, in Amos Barton.
Yes, yes.
She does exactly the same, and it comes as a bit of a shock that she suddenly stops and says, well, this is what I'm going to do.
Yes, that's the very first of her scenes
It
of clerical
is.
life. It's her
It
first
is indeed.
piece of fiction. I know.
Yes.
I know it is. Of course, a lot of other writers did do the same, actually, but it's quite a bold, as I suggested, quite a bold thing for her to do as a child, or a beginner,
Yes.
as admittedly later than a Dickens or something. Dickens could be more, foolhardy because he was starting as a young man. Difficult for her. She was almost 40 when she started, and also by nature, as we know, diffident. And she had her situation to worry about with Lewis and the fact that her family had disowned her and so on. So she had her own, I suppose you would call it makes me think of the opening of Silas Marner with his bag of tools on his back. And she had, metaphorically, on her back, all the things that had happened to her, which were both ordinary and normal, and yet not. Right? So who knows what she would have done.
Any other questions or comments?
I was just thinking when you're talking about the inconclusive endings, whether that might be something that influenced Henry James, because he's a great critic of Eliot, really revealing. And I just think about the end of Portrait of a Lady in particular, which is very frustrating in lots of ways and doesn't give us that kind of ending of justice satisfied, which we find really delightful as readers. And I was wondering if that's one of the ways in which Eliot's influence on James might be most felt, actually, this sense of an inconclusive ending, or a kind of less felt ending.
I think that might be right, Gail, because of course what he also, like Virginia Woolf, was very admiring but not lavish with his praise, and more lavish in some ways with his criticism, even as a younger man, younger than her. And what I think he disliked or didn't admire was the same thing that Leslie Stephen didn't admire, was too much intellectualism, and perhaps too much direction by the writer, directing you to think things. So then that would feed through into the idea that an ending which is not too pedantic and so on would be what he would like to do. He would do. I was just thinking, we've got to bring this to a close, but I've been a bit mean about Dickens, but I was before that. I mean, I looked through all Jane Austen's endings. Now they are, as you might expect, clever, because her endings are quite like, or put it that way, George Eliot knew her Jane Austen, quite similar, quite quiet in many ways, and they all did the usual thing of giving you what happened to the main characters in a few years later and what they were all doing. And of course, I've shown you the doling out of the punishments and the other thing. But it's not just that, because at the very end, she is often, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, when finally Elizabeth and Darcy get together, and it's all happy ending. And she gives you the happy ending, but she does it slightly. She allows Darcy's horrible aunt, Lady Catherine, Lady Catherine to something or other, who of course is a snob, and she didn't approve of the marriage and so on. But at the very end, he introduces her again, and how she finally condescended to appreciate the happiness of this young couple. And it ends with Jane Austen telling us it was all happy, happy marriage and happy ever after, but with this kind of taking on for a moment, the doing it through the condescending view. Not that Jane Austen was taking the condescending view, but she very cleverly keeps the Lady Catherine characteristic as she gives you the happy ending, so that it's not too sentimentalised. Do you see what I mean? It's really clever, and she does it in one or two of the other novels. And of course, I've read all her novels lots of times, but how often do you actually go back and look at the last lines? And you very often misremember endings. And endings, of course, can be a whole chapter or a whole paragraph or just a word or just a sentence. But anyway, Jane Austen is good. But Dickens, his his best novel, not by any means his best novel, but his best novel for beginnings and endings. What do you think I'm going to say? Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, the worst of times, the over that. And the ending? It is a far, far better thing that I do now than I have ever done. He avoids the trap of going on and saying, as Sidney Carton said as he went to the scaffold. It's brilliant. Brilliant.
Right. Well, it's been a wonderful afternoon. Thoroughly enjoyable, and you've given us so much to think about and talk about, Rosemary. It's great. Obviously, Rosemary has a train to catch eventually. But there is. Oh, all right.
Yes, we're all.
Yes, all right. But there is a sales table here. There are people to chat to. There are refreshments in one of the other rooms, I think, Jeff, aren't they?
We can move in just through the corridor on the right.
Right.
And also I should be in the Mayor's Chamber for another half an hour if anybody wants to have a quick.
Well, that's if you haven't seen the Mayor's Park, the Mayor's Chamber, yes, that's well worth seeing. Some wonderful silverware there. I should also thank, before sort of finally thanking Rosemary, on the Mayor's right is the leader of the council, Chris Wilson, and we're most grateful to you, Chris, for being here this afternoon. And it was Councillor Chris Wilson who gave instructions that we were to be allowed to have the use of this chamber. So we are in your debt, and we owe you gratitude for that. Joanne mentioned the City of Culture Middlemarch Mystery. The last event of the festival is Ruth Livesey is coming to talk about it with two of the people who were involved. So if you haven't booked up for that yet, it's free actually. It's a free one. That. And also on Monday we've got Beverly Rylett, who is sitting. She's made it here. It's so good that you could, Bev, because she's been at another conference and managed to get here for today. But she'll be talking about the digitisation process, which is fascinating. And there are three people from Leicester who will be here for that event, and that will be at Children's Coat and Heritage Centre. So thank you once again, Rosemary, for a wonderful presentation. It's lovely to have you back, and it's lovely for us to be back in these sort of familiar surroundings. There's something special about this room.
Well, thank you very much. It's a lovely hall to talk in, I must say, and you've all been your questions and suggestions and criticisms have all been extremely interesting, so many thanks from my point of view.
Thank you, Rosemary.